All right, guys, it's been a crazy couple of weeks, and the YouTube channel now up and running, and the YouTube audience has actually more than doubled in the last 2 months or so. So it's really good. And what I realized, like I was just thinking about what am I going to talk about today, and I realized that an awful lot of you here that are watching now are very new to this content, and you may not have actually heard any of my backstory. You may be curious about some of those things, and so what I've done is I've gone back through my podcasts, going way back to when I started. I started this podcast in April 2020, during the lockdown, and fast forward today, this is episode number 142. But I've gone back to some of the early podcasts that I published way back at the very start, and I'm having a look at the transcripts, and I found some really interesting information sitting in there. And I thought, you know what, just because I've said it 2 years ago, it's probably all new to an awful lot of you. So I'm going to go back over some of the valuable content, well, what I perceive as valuable content that I think you guys might be interested in. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Specifically, I'm going back to episode number 8, which I published in June 2020. And I never recorded these episodes on video. It was always audio only. And so that's why when I talk about this, channel now, I always use the word podcast, but in fact, it's now obviously a video channel as well. Now, that particular episode number 8, I covered 3 things. I covered my first deal, my best deal, and I covered my very worst deal. And there's quite a roller coaster ride in there. And so what I thought I'll do is, let's start anyway with the first deal, and we'll see how far we get, see how long this episode takes. So the original podcast, the reason that I covered this as a topic originally was that I got a listener question, and it was from a chap called Owen Brady. Now, Owen told me that he had just binged all 7 of my episodes up to that point and wanted to know, was there any big wins that I could tell him where I added an awful lot of value very, very quickly. And so first of all, Owen, if you're still listening, I'm not sure if you are, but shout out to Owen for being one of the early listeners. But second of all, and just a little bit of a word of advice, but if you ever want something from somebody, like an answer to their question, throw in a little bit of the, I've binged all your episodes, because that music to the host's ears, and you'll certainly get a bit of a better chance of getting your question answered. They say that flattery helps a lot, and definitely it does. So before I get into this, I want to reiterate, jokes aside, I want to reiterate that as I'm talking about this stuff, it can often come across as, making money in the property sector is as easy as just, rolling the dice and you're going to win big. And so I want to go back to some of the advice that I started giving when I started this podcast, and that is patience and discipline. And that sometimes is not a particularly sexy thing to say, but patience and discipline is the kind of behavior that ultimately pays out in this business. And, if you have a tendency to quickly jump into deals, you might get a load of deals. You might get over the line with things, and it might do very well for you. And certainly that was working for me in the early days. But this can have quite a bite if it goes wrong for you. And this stuff comes back to bite you. And so just be very careful not to pile in without covering all of the procedures and your due diligence and all that stuff, because I paid a very hefty price in 2008 when the market crashed. But prior to that, the previous 5 years, I was a bit of a gambler, and it really worked very, very well in a rising market. As soon as a market turns from a rising market to a falling market, then that kind of behavior can be punished very, very heavily. So you have to be careful. So that's why I wanted to cover, when I'm talking about, I'm going to talk my first deal. So whatever my first deal, it is what it is. But my best and my worst deal, I brought the worst in to completely balance the equation. I didn't want to sort of give you this best deal and then just leave it at that, because it would sound like it's a bonanza. But there's also the worst deal where you kind of give back a lot of your profits. And ultimately, what's the point in making loads of money if you end up giving it back on the next deal? So that's one of the reasons why I just want to reiterate that. That being said, let's get into my very first deal. And I'm going to tell you about, it was actually my first deal, was my family home, or was my own home that I bought at the ripe old age of 20. And this was way back in May 1993. And the address was Heytesbury Lane in Dublin 4. And it was a tiny, tiny little mews house. And mews house, if you're not familiar, they are these small little cottages that are basically built in the rear garden of the big, grand kind of townhouses that line the streets, the Georgian kind of streets and stuff of Dublin. Now, in this particular case, this house was in the rear garden of the main house on Waterloo Road. On Wellington Road. So there's Heytesbury Lane runs down the centre of the two houses back onto. So it's Waterloo Road on one side, Wellington Road on the other side. The big houses are on those, and then the street down the middle, where you would basically bring your horse and cart after you dropped off the lady and the owner of the house. You would bring the horse and cart around to the stables, and that's what Heytesbury Lane was. It was a mews lane for the stables. And you would have, my house that I bought, this little tiny mews, it was a 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom house, but effectively this was like a stable. So it would have been for the stable boy to live there, and it would have been, you would have parked the cart in this old house, and the horses probably would have lived there as well. So it was effectively a stables that I bought. That was my first home. And I paid, now bear in mind, this is Irish pounds at the time. So I paid 85,000 Irish pounds for it. And that's the equivalent, if you do the conversion, of 108,000 euro in today's money. So I lived there for 6 years. And I have to say, I absolutely loved living in the middle of town. Like Heytesbury Lane's right in the middle of it all. And Bagot Street's just down the road. So as a young guy, you couldn't get better a place to live. And so really, really lived it up for those six years as a kind of a bachelor, young man about town. In 1999, I got engaged. So I'd been living there 6 or 7 years, and I got engaged, and we decided, my fiance at the time and we decided that we would buy a house together, because she had some money to put into buying a house, and I had some money to put into buying a house. So we thought, let's pool our resources and buy something together. And so and it was also time to move in together or whatever, because we're getting married. And what we decided to do was buy a house on Whitethorn Road in Clonskee. Now, rather than sell my mews house, well, first of all, I didn't want to sell anything because I absolutely loved that house. It was so convenient being right in the middle of town and everything like that. Whenever the concerts were on in the RDS, I can remember on the day of one of my birthdays, U2 were playing in the RDS. And I was sitting out in my backyard, and I could actually hear the concert really, really clearly from my backyard so the centre of town was full of life, and Lansdowne Road is only down the road, so the big rugby matches and all that kind of stuff. It was the centre of the universe as far as I was concerned. I did not want to sell this property, and the fact that I was getting married, it was kind of, well, we'll move into this bigger house, but we'll keep this, for moving back into later. And anyway, I found a tenant willing to move into the house very, very quickly. And that's the great thing about a good location, is that you'll never struggle to find a tenant. And in those 7 years that I've been living there, prices had risen quite steeply. And so the rent was £1,400. And that was, if you do the equation or the conversion to euro, that was €1,777. And so I was getting that per month. Now, if you do the maths, you can figure out that the yield on this property deal was quite good. It was my first home, so obviously I didn't earn any rent for those initial 5 or 6 years. But when I did put it on the market, I had paid £85,000 for that property, and I was now getting £1,400 a month for it. And if you do the maths, that is £16,800 per annum. And if you do the calculation to work out the gross yield, that works out at a 19.7% gross yield. So we'll say ballpark 20%. And that effectively means that the rent that I was getting per year was equivalent to 1/5 of the cost of the property. So every 5 years that I had that house rented at that amount, that was the property paid for. And so it was obviously a great, cracking deal. Now, in the end, I held on to that Muse house for almost 20 years. And believe it or not, the exact same tenant that I had for those entire 20 years, that was the same tenant lived there for that entire time. And when I eventually sold the property, I actually sold the property with the tenant in situ. And during those 20 years, he paid me 330,000 Irish pounds, the equivalent being €425,000 over that period of time. So do the maths there and figure out like that is effectively the house paid for about 4 times over throughout the life of my owning it. So that was my very first property. Now, I did mention I moved into a house with my fiance at the time, and that was a house on Whitethorn Road in Clonskee. That was a 3-bedroom, slightly bigger house, further out of town, but not so far. It's actually a nice area, Clonskee. It's right beside UCD, the big university. And it was a 3-bedroom Crampton-built house, is what you would call that. And Crampton were a family that built a lot of houses in the 1950s. And I believe this house had been built around about 1952 or something. And the reason I know that is because when I was renovating it, we actually found a milk bottle buried in concrete in the house. And when we smashed open the bottle, we found a newspaper and a handwritten note. And the newspaper had the date 1952, and the handwritten note was saying, this bottle is being left here today in the concrete as we're setting it. And it was really fantastic to find that. And what I actually did was I took the newspaper and the handwritten note and I framed it, and I actually put it on the wall in the house so you can kind of see. But it was really interesting, nice bit of nostalgia there. Now, what I really loved about this house when I went and I bought it, before I bought it, I was going to view it. And they had this really long rear garden, and they had a side garage. And so I saw huge potential. And first of all, I was an architect. So an architect can see a lot of potential because obviously the mind is working on the designs and stuff like that. But what was really stood out for me was the rear garden was completely overgrown. I mean, completely overgrown. And I decided I wanted to go out and see, how big the rear garden was. And this was before Google Earth and Google Maps and all that kind of stuff. So you couldn't see, pinching the screen on your phone how big the property was. You just had to go out and kind of feel around. So I scrambled out into this jungle, effectively. There was brambles coming out right into the middle of the garden. There was lots and lots of apple trees and all of this stuff. And what I kind of felt like I needed a machete to get through it. It was so thick. So I eventually managed to kind of make my way to the back. I think I found a stick or something to beat the stuff back, and got all the way to the back wall and turned around and looked. And the house was way, way down the garden. And I remember thinking, wow, this is a huge garden. I think it was over 100 foot long. And so I saw, wow, huge potential here. And I was the only person at the viewing that went to the trouble of getting to the back garden because it was so difficult to reach. And so I thought to myself, this is a big opportunity, like a lot of room for expansion, and nobody else is going to know this. Nobody else is going to go to this trouble. So that was, to me, a big opportunity. Extension and all that. The other thing that was interesting about this is it was an executor sale. Now, what that means is an elderly lady had been living in this property, and either she died living there or she went off to a nursing home and she died, but she had left this property behind for her family and passed it on to her children. And I can't remember the details, but let's say she had 4 or 5 kids. And what happens in that situation is, the kids aren't living in the property. They've all grown up and they're living elsewhere. And so they just decide, look, let's go and sell the property and then divvy up the whatever it sells for. So they put it in the hands of an auctioneer, and it was, put on the market as is. So you're taking the property in its original state, and so it becomes a real fixer-upper. In this case, it was super dated, like everything was original. So the windows were single glazed. The kitchen was like really, really out of date, like completely out of date, kind of like a scullery. It had like these huge, big, deep sort of kitchen sinks and stuff. Bathroom, super old as well. Didn't have a shower. It had like one of these big, deep baths. And so everything about it had to change. So I decided I'm going to go and try and buy this. Went into the auction. And for those of you who don't know, like an auction can be kind of a scary thing. This was my first auction. This is in May 1999. And what's scary about an auction is that you have to send your solicitor in to do the review of the title and all that before you actually go to the auction, because you go in there ready to buy, like you are now committed and you are going to go for it. And you have to bring your checkbook with you, because you will be paying 10%. If you're successful in the auction, you will be handing over a check for 10% of the property price there and then. And you'll be signing a contract. You'll be in contract to complete that property like a month later or something. So you go in with 10% deposit, and the auction is crazy. The speed that it goes in. I can remember going in, and I think I set myself a price limit of £350 to buy this property. And I was, I think they were guiding 310, if I'm correct, or something like that. I can't remember the details, it's so far back now. But maybe they were guiding like 290 or 300 or 310 or something like that. So I kind of thought, okay, what can I go to? I can probably go to about 350. And I thought to myself, but I really want this property. So you go into the auction. The auctioneer is standing up the front of the room, and I sat up the front, and I kind of was wearing my jacket and tie. Wanted to kind of look, respectable. Wanted to be taken serious because I was still kind of a youngish guy. And the auctioneer goes out, do I have 250? They kind of read out the details. This property is this and this, great opportunity, blah, blah, blah. Do I have 250? Do I have an offer of 250? And they're looking around the room. Do I have 250? Anybody 250? And then I decided, being green as I am, most people never make the first sort of offer. But I put my hand up and said 250. So he goes, I have 250 here. Do I have 255? And that's when other people jump in. So somebody put their hand up at the back, 255. I put my hand up, 260. And in the space that I'm saying this to you, this is how it happened in the auctioneer. 265. Do I have, 270, 275. Do I have 280, 280? Do I have 280, 285, 290, 295, 300, 310, 3, and it went up and up and up like this. And the speed was just crazy. There was 3 people bidding on the property, myself and 2 others. And so it was going up in these increments, 5,000 increments, very, very quickly. And in the end, I think one of the buyers dropped away. So it was just me and this other buyer. And it was 380. Do I have 385? And I put my hand up, and it goes 380. Okay, there's 390 over here. And so I put my hand up, 390. And then the guy that I was bidding against bid 391. And he turned to me, to you, sir, do you want to go again? And I said, 392. And he looked to the other guy, and the guy backed out. And he goes, boom, with the big hammer. Sold. 392 to this man here at the front row. And that was it. In the blink of an eye, like literally in under 60 seconds, you're now responsible for the purchase of this property. You're going to take your check out, and you're going to write a check for 39,200 right there and then. So quite scary, but at the same time super exciting, because now you own this thing, and there's not all of this waiting for auctioneers or waiting for the estate agents to call you back saying, yeah, your offer, he's interested, but he wants a bit more and all this kind of stuff. So anyway, fast forward. And one of the reasons I really, really thought that worked out to be a great deal is because it being my family home, any increase at all in the value would be completely tax-free. And because it was an executor sale, and because it was in such a state of poor condition, I was going to be completely modernizing it, and I was going to be doing extension, like big, expansive extension out the rear and the side and all that kind of stuff. And I probably spent the guts of £200,000 on improving that property. But I sold it 7 years later. in 2006 for 1.9 million. And so a massive, massive gain. And I would say, like, you know, because obviously there's a conversion, 392 in euros. 392 in euros, let me work it out. That's 426,000 euro. Plus I spent about 200,000. So you're talking about we'll say 650 I spent on the property, but I sold it for 1.9. So a 1.25 million profit on that deal, completely tax-free. Now, some of the stuff that I did with doing up that particular house was quite unconventional. There was a side garage, but what I actually did was demolish the garage, and then instead of building completely out where the garage sat, I created a side passage so that I could bring bicycles and bins and things like that down to the back garden. And then what I did is I extended the house out only half of the distance that the garage had sat. And that might sound counterintuitive, like as to a good deal, but what it means is that rooms deeper in the house actually get a lot of direct sunlight and daylight. And so that worked out very, very well. It meant that the kitchen deep inside the house actually had a great aspect. You had a lot of light coming in and stuff. So that's something that doesn't always work out. And then I extended out the rear. I built this lovely family room that had double doors out into the patio and stuff like that. And anyway, it was a fantastic house. I really, really enjoyed living there. And it worked out really well. Obviously, 1.25 million, that was kind of like, you know, on to the next deal and stuff like that. So guys, that is about 25 minutes or thereabouts. I think what we'll do, rather than going into the best and the worst deals here, we're going to do part 2. And so stay tuned for part 2 on this, and I'll be covering my best deal and my worst deal in the upcoming events. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. It really does help. Now, you know, obviously watching today's topic is helpful. Maybe you might find some of the tips and stuff like that, but you're only going to get so much from one video. It's obviously much better if you watch another. So over on my right here, I'm going to point you to a playlist that I have, and if you have a look there, you're going to find plenty of value. And so if you haven't already, please consider subscribing, and I will catch you in the next video.